Hi, everybody. My name is Drew Moffat. I will be talking to you about Laudato Si. It's part of the encyclical by Pope Francis. Chapter 2 is all about the gospel of creation. So, I'll be talking about the organization of Chapter 2, and then the biblical accounts of relationships between human and nature, and then also the origin of the world through creation and different viewpoints on God's presence. And then I'll tie it up with the importance of respecting your fellow man and the importance of global peace and respecting those around you and spreading the wealth. So with organization, it's separated into seven different sections, and then each of those sections I'll be covering in deeper thought. So the first section was the light offered by faith, and this says that we must always respect different cultures and different viewpoints, even if it's a different religion or culture. So with this, Christians have a responsibility within creation to care for nature and those around them. So we must respect other people. The second section was the wisdom of the biblical accounts, and this, like the goal of this section, was what do biblical narratives say about the relationship between humans and the world. So he establishes through Genesis and a couple other biblical things. With Genesis, he said that he used a line from Genesis 1 saying that every man and woman is created out of love and made in God's image and likeness. So we are, and then he continued with that by saying we are capable of love, self-knowledge, self-possession, and we are freely communicating with others. And that human life is grounded by three things: the relationship with God, with your neighbor, and with the earth. And that breaking these relationships results in, or from sin, can result in violence. And a good quote that Pope Francis included was, society has broken relationships by presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge that we are creaturely limited, so we cannot know everything about everything. And then he said that sin is a manifest in all of its destructive power in wars and the various forms of violence and abuse, and the most vulnerable is nature, and we abuse that one the most. And this is where we get global warming and that sort of thing. And then Genesis grants dominion over the earth, and that dominion over creatures and nature leads to the destruction of natural relationships. In absolute dominance, he said, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me, and this is part of Leviticus 25. There should exist a mutual relationship between nature and creation, and this includes subsistence, protection, and then fruitfulness for the future generations. So we must preserve our nature, and so that the future generations have it to prosper with. He also used the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain killed his brother out of envy, and this broke the relationship between him and God, and he was cursed from the ground. It's part of Genesis 4. And then he used the story of Noah, and God threatens to end humanity because there's so much violence and there's not peace anymore. And this stresses caring for others and nature as a whole. He also included words from John Paul II, and he says that those who are committed to defending human dignity can find in the Christian faith the deepest reason for this commitment. And he follows that by saying life is not a hopeless chaos, and that everything happens for a reason, and people in the world is not dedicated to pure luck or chance. Other biblical ideals that he follows was that the Bible laws focus on relationships between all living beings, so we must respect each other, and that humans are gifted with intelligence, so we must respect creation as a whole. And creatures reflect a part of God's vast wisdom and intelligence, so we must follow through with that and respect each other. He also gave ideas from past civilizations and said that during the Babylonian captivity, it led to a greater, a deeper faith in God, and this helped regain hope in time of despair. And then this was also the same thing as during the Roman captivity, when they tried to take over and complete dominance over the world. And those who were found faithful found consolation and a hope in God. The next section was the mystery of the universe, and this focused on nature versus creation, as well as the origin of the world in Judeo-Christian thought. So with nature and creation, he stated that creation means more than nature. It deals with God's loving plan in which every creature has its own value and significance. So we are all unique in ourselves, and that nature is seen as a system that can be observed, while creation is seen as a gift from God. So we must preserve nature and keep it as pristine as possible. With the origin of the world, he said that it is a result of a decision and not by chance. And this goes along with everything happens for a reason, and that God's love is a fundamental moving force in all created things. This is part of paragraph 77. With the Judeo-Christian thought, they believed that nature was no longer divine, and this emphasized human responsibility for nature, and that humans we develop nature, whether it's through agriculture, that sort of thing, and we must acknowledge that nature is fragile and we are able to break it apart. So through overfishing or that sort of thing. And then with the humanistic perspective, there's biblical accounts of creation. They make us seen as subjects who cannot be dehumanized or reduced to the status of an object. And then also with that, nature cannot be solely seen as a prophet. So that leads to violence and greed, and then the destruction or abuse of nature. The next section focuses on the message of each creature and harmony of creation. And this shows we share a friendship with God in certain places, and this develops personal meaning to locations, and going back to these places helps recover parts of the past. There also includes information about the catechism and how creatures depend on each other for survival, which is kind of the main goal of the catechism. And then along with this, he includes this. Pope Francis said, God wills the interdependence of creatures, so this goes along with relying on other creatures for survival or for protection. The next part of that was that the bishops of Brazil, he included information from them, and they believe that nature is a locus of God's presence, and finding this presence helps us develop ecological virtues, and there are actually 8 or 9 of these virtues. The first being sustainability, and that's living within the bounds of the earth. The next is adaptability, and that's recognizing limits and adapting to changes in the environment. Relationality is the next one, and it's everything is connected, so when you do one thing, it affects something else, so there's always a different outcome. And then frugality, which is being thrifty or conservative, either with money or possessions. And then there's equity, which is spreading things equally with goods and services, so being equal to all society. And then solidarity, which is a response to human independence, so again, depending on other creatures for survival. And then biodiversity, which is there's a lot of different creatures and different animals and different things that are in the universe. And then there's sufficiency, which is solutions to problems must be proportional to their magnitude. So global warming is a really big deal, so we must attribute a lot of time and energy into solving that problem. And then lastly, humility, and that's the limitation of human knowledge, so a more realistic virtue. And then the next section was a universal communion, and this goes with the rich versus the poor, as well as interconnected themes that you can't separate, and the love for fellow man, so again, respect. Rich versus poor situation, that includes superiority, and some consider themselves more human than others, and this is just not healthy. And a good quote is, at times we see an obsession with denying any preeminence to the human person. More zeal is shown in protecting other species than in defending the dignity which all human beings share in equal measure. This is part of paragraph 90. And that shows how either the rich, they kind of stick to themselves and they put more energy and time into protecting themselves as opposed to humanity as a whole. And some of those themes I talked about that cannot be separated includes peace, justice, and the preservation of creation. And in unison, all these themes make a better world. And then that ties into as well the love of a fellow man. And a good quote that I got was that concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a severe loving for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of our society. So we must combat the problems, and that we have one heart, so we can't mistreat something but completely love something else. That kind of stuck with me as well. The next section was the common destination of goods, and this was focused on God created the world for everyone, so the fruits and everything must be shared equally. And God gave the earth to the entire human race without excluding or favoring anyone. This was part of encyclical letter Sanctissimus, which this kind of goes again with no one should be favored, so there shouldn't be no rich versus poor. Everybody should be equal. And then in this section, he also talks down on private property and the idea that everything is split up and goes to the highest bidder, because this completely contradicts exactly what Jesus stood for and what we are blessed to serve with. And then a good example of equality that was included in this section was that in Paraguay, everybody must be able to access technical education, credit insurance, property, and markets. So this just shows a prime example of how equality is working. The last section was the gaze of Jesus, and Jesus stresses the idea that everyone is important in God's eye. Jesus said to admire the beauty of nature, so we must preserve that. And then Jesus makes peace by the blood on his cross. That was a big part. So we must also make peace because he did that for us. And then, so what I kind of talked about was the structure of chapter 2. the relationship between humans and nature and religious works, whether it was Genesis or different stories from Cain and Abel or that sort of thing. Then I talked about the origin of the world and creation versus nature, and then God's presence and the effects and what global warming is doing to those kind of like big things, and then the importance of respecting other creatures and equality and justice to all. Thank you very much.